or you all have something completely new that nobody else knows about me. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Abigail Echo-Hawk. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. My father came to Alaska in the late 1960s where they were building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. He heard from one of his relatives that there were really great jobs, and he was a land surveyor. So he came here, ended up in Fairbanks, and met my mother. So I was also, I was born in Fairbanks Memorial and raised in the Tanana Chiefs Clinic in Fairbanks, Alaska, and also came in and out of AHHA as needed through my childhood. So growing in Alaska was one of the best things that ever happened to me. My mother is one of the adopted children of Katie John of Mentasta Lake, Alaska. So I was born in this incredible strength and resiliency of the indigenous peoples of Alaska and the culture and the traditions of the Athabascan people and the Pawnee people. And one of the things that I was first taught in those communities is, what does it mean to give? What does it mean to contribute to the well-being of our communities? What does it mean to be so invested in the lives and well-being of our people that we will look for every opportunity to see what we did great, what maybe we didn't do so well, and how we can do that better. So sitting in a space like this, y'all are my people. I know that's what you do. I know that is what you're dedicated to. And I know that it is through the experiences and lessons together that we can grow to even be better in service to all people. I'm going to share with you today the story and journey of what I've been on around Indigenous data. I want you to think about these stories and how they apply not just to the Alaska Native and American Indian communities that exist here in the state of Alaska, but these are also things you can think about when you're working with people of other identities and culture. And what does data mean to us? So data to me is story. So I want to start with a story. This story comes from my Uncle Fred John, who is one of the children of my Grandma Katie. I was raised next to him in Delta Junction, Alaska with his children. I have a bunch of, I stayed with my cousin last night. We call ourselves the John-Hawks. We were raised as siblings. We had houses as close together as houses are in the interior of Alaska. You know, it took me 10 minutes to run there. At night, our parents would call each other and be like, "Who do you have?" And that's where we slept. We were really raised in a community. My Uncle Fred used to tell us this story, and it was one of my favorite stories. So he was born and raised in Mentasta Village. Who all knows where Mentasta Village might be? It's one of the highway villages, as we call them. It's kind of centered in between Tok and Glen Allen. And in that village, however, when he was raised, they were about 11 miles off the nearest road. There was no road into where they were. And you know, he's about 5 or 6 years old, and all of these cool things are happening. You know, there's a lot of change happening. There's highways coming through, hard things and good things happening in our village communities. And I always thought this was the funniest story. He'd tell us about missionary barrels. I didn't know this was something other people didn't know about until I left Alaska and my small community. But what used to happen is missionaries would either come to the village, but what they would actually do is they'd leave at the kind of where the dirt road was then at that time in between Tok and Glen Allen. They would leave big barrels that churches across the United States would gather up clothes for the Native people in Alaska and be part of the missionary outreach, clothes and different things, and they put them in these barrels, and then they'd leave them at the top of the road. And the folks from the village would get in their dog sleds. You know, they'd go up there and check, and they'd pick up a big barrel, and they'd take it back to the village, and they'd open it up. And you never knew what was going to be in there. People in Pennsylvania, people in Florida are sending some crazy stuff to the interior of Alaska. Like, clearly we're not out there wearing like these tank tops, and they're like, you know, like satin shirts. And it was always fun and exciting. They more often take the clothes apart and make them into something else. But at the bottom of one of these barrels, my Uncle Fred John is about 6 years old. And they find at the bottom of one of these barrels like a bag. And inside this bag is a whole bunch of other things that he said look like a bunch of little bags of onion bags. He's like, it was like, and inside those little onion bags were all these beautiful, beautiful objects. They had no idea what they were. And so they handed them out, people, children, whoever wanted them was like, what are these things? So they gave him one of these bags, and he said he loved this bag. He was like, he had it for a couple days, he'd throw it into the air, and the shiny things inside would make all kinds of noises and clank against each other. Well, my grandma Katie sent him out to go get firewood. So it's a day like this, but in Matasta Village, it's so silent except for what you hear when your feet step on the snow. Y'all know what that sounds like. You can't hear anything else but the creek that is running, because where we're at, our Fish Creek runs, it doesn't freeze up that often because it's glacier fed. And he said, I could hear the trees, and I could feel myself stomping. He's like, I walked out across Fish Creek. He said, he was standing there on that bridge, and he had this bag, and he's throwing it in the air, and he's like, I wonder what it'd sound like if I dropped one of these into the water. So he pulled a little hole into his little onion sack. He took out one of these beautiful little objects, and then he dropped one into the water. He said, it was the most beautiful little sound, just a little ping. He's like, oh, that's cool, it only sticks. And so he just keeps doing it over and over and over again until he has none left. And he said he just stuffed his little onion bag in his pocket, and he brought my grandma her firewood. He always ends his story with, this is how he lost his marbles. Oh. But when he told me this story, and I was moving into my career at that time, I was leading one of the largest research centers in the nation on American Indian Alaska Native health. And I was working with all of these incredible researchers, hospital systems, individuals who were really looking to improve the lives and well-being of Indigenous peoples who right now have some of the worst health disparities in the country are experienced by Native people. And I thought about those little bags. Too often in the healthcare system and in world, we bring in things that are bright, shiny objects we all know about. But does it actually work in Matasta Lake, Alaska? Is it appropriate in the Tanana Chief Center at Fairbanks? Does it meet the needs of the community that we're serving? And did we bring enough information to tell them about it, to shape it, to invest it? And I think about what it's like in the interior of Alaska, you know, in December. Man, some kids could have had some fun with some marbles on the floor of my grandma's house in that cold, cold weather where, you know, there's not a lot to do. How do we ensure that we aren't just dropping shiny little marbles into the water for one tiny little sound and something that doesn't actually move forward meaningful change? Because meaningful change is where we have to be. My parents, Howard and Yvonne Echo-Hawk, were the spiritual people in our village and still are. Before I was 20, I had been to 20 funerals. I had been to funerals of babies in tiny little boxes. I had been to funerals of one of my elders who was just known for being a great, hilarious, loud, and large man that they actually took out the window of our community center and had to slide his coffin through the window. I sat in potlatches overnight where we sang, we laughed, we grieved. But as a child, should I have been going to 20 funerals before I was 20? That is too often the experiences within our communities, and there is the opportunity for meaningful change. Because these are the ones that we are working for. These are my nieces at my grandma Katie's house. This was right before she had passed on. She left us when she was 97 years old with the dedication that our people are who we work for. And it's because of their dedication that the work that I have been able to do. I also am the Executive Vice President of the Seattle Indian Health Board, a federally qualified health center in Seattle, serving American Indians and Alaska Natives and everybody else who comes in our doors the Native way. We have 3 sites and are about to reopen a 92-bed inpatient treatment center, providing culturally specific care for American Indians and Alaska Natives. I also direct the nation's only National Tribal Epidemiology Center, and I'm trained as an epidemiologist. Because the data is so important. The stories of our people. So everything I've been sharing with you, even the faces of these beautiful young people, the next leaders, the ones who hopefully will be sitting in your chairs in 25 years, they deserve to be working on something that is different than what we did. Because what is it that we're going to do? And I think when we think about quality improvement and changes and opportunities, sometimes we think too short. This is where the teachings of Indigenous people, I think, come in. I've always been taught to think about for the 7th generation in the future. There are organizations here in the city where there are 100 generations in the future is what they're making their moves and changes and programs for now. How do we ensure those who step into our footsteps aren't doing the exact same work want anybody else to have to do what I did in doing one of the very first clinical trials with acutely suicidal American Indian Alaska Natives. I don't want suicide to be one of the leading causes of death of our Native youth. I'm tired of sitting in rooms where we tell the stories of our people who are carrying their babies who don't ever have the opportunity to live to hold their baby. Maternal and infant death. And I have been fortunately and unfortunately had the honor of being one of the leading researchers on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and people. So when I thought about what I could share with you, I co-authored one of the very first reports in the state of Alaska on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it ties to all the things that I just talked to you about. Because it's a story of a community, and people, when I talk about this subject, will be like, well, that sounds like something that's just for law enforcement. Like, why are we, as healthcare providers and healthcare facilities, why is this something we need to know about? I'm going to share that story with you because I want you to understand the impacts of the physical, emotional, spiritual, cultural health, and how the information that is gathered by your facilities is what allows us to provide the intervention and prevention to ensure that we have the stories of people that is needed in order to make meaningful change. So who are missing and murdered Indigenous peoples? Has anybody ever heard of this movement? It's very strong here in the state of Alaska. I sit on the board of Indigenous Data for Justice, have done a lot of work in this area, have worked with a lot of families, a lot of communities, a lot of tribal leaders. This is a crisis of violence. It's a crisis of violence that many of us see every day. So how did I get into this work? I got into this work at the age of 6 years old. The age of 6 years old, and I'm going to tell hard stories, and I know that you all hear, see, and experience hard stories in the work that you do. At the age of 6 years old, I was sexually assaulted for the very first time. I experienced rape at that time because it happened in a village. When my parents called the state troopers, they came in and said, we don't have the time or resources to do an investigation, and they just let it go. So who cared for the physical for me as a child who did have physical things that were a direct result of that? It was the folks at Chief Andrew Isaac. It was the small clinic in Delta Junction, Alaska. And then as a teenager, as a result of never at that time, we did not have access to behavioral health services. When I was experiencing things such as being an acutely suicidal 9-year-old, who was there to support me and to give me the kindness and the love? It was the hospital systems. When others don't touch us in the same ways and don't provide the justice that we deserve, here in the state of Alaska specifically, it is very often the facilities in which you are a part of. And when we look at the crisis of violence, here we have the impact of violence on Indigenous youth, one like myself. It's a miracle I was not in the statistics as a 9-year-old who attempted suicide for the very first time at 9 years old, and then continued to do so until I was 17. Those are the statistics and the stories that are hard to hear, but are a necessary one for us to tell. So when we think about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, it isn't one of just that one moment in time where somebody was assaulted, somebody was trafficked, somebody was kidnapped, somebody went missing, or when they were murdered. It's the reverberation of the physical, emotional, spiritual, and cultural trauma on that individual and their families and their communities. The story my dad told me when I was 22 years old of, what did you do after that police officer had just told you your daughter did not matter? And I didn't know that he had disappeared for 24 hours with a rifle, driving through in between Mentasta Village and Delta Junction, Alaska. He said he drove back and forth and he was missing for 24 hours. And my mother didn't know where he was. What does the mental health impact look like for a father? And honestly, I can't even get my mother at this point. She doesn't want to share information related to that, and that is her choice. But that also indicates to me that was an impact. And in order to tell the story of this impact, I embarked on a journey to discover what was the actual data on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I was with my Uncle Will Mayo in Fairbanks, and I had started to gather information in cities, including several cities here in the state of Alaska, on the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I was reviewing this report and what was going to be coming out of that with the tribal leaders. I was meeting with my Uncle Will Mayo, and there was the name of a woman who was killed on the campus of UAF. And we thought we had her name correct and information correct. And we had gotten this information from the state troopers. And so I was going it over with him. He said, Abigail, her name is spelled wrong. I said, are you sure, Uncle? Because this is exactly what the state troopers gave to us. And this is the information they gave about her murder. He said, I know it's wrong. I know her family. I was the tribal leader that met with them when they discovered her body. And I thought about the data we were gathering that was then and is still being used in this report that was released in 2018 to allocate resources for American Indians and Alaska Natives, predominantly actually at this point has been healthcare resources, less in law enforcement, which I hope more of, to address this crisis. But what we found was not only data like that my Uncle Will helped me fix here for the state of Alaska, but we actually found that law enforcement was not collecting race or ethnicity for the people in which they were interacting. And I wish I was surprised, but I wasn't. I've been working in research and working in hospital systems, trying to find the stories of American Indians and Alaska Native peoples in the data and not being able to find it. I kept questioning why. I worked within one hospital system where I was like, well, what is it about your data? Why can't we find the data on American Indians and Alaska Natives? And we go through, we look at all their drop-down menus, you all know how it is. You look at all the different things, and they're like, oh my God, we don't actually have a checkbox for that. They have to write it in an other section. I was like, well, what happens to the other section? They're like, well, we don't have the time or resources to actually go through and look at every single one of those. And then us try to categorize it like that's just not our jobs. We just don't have the time to do that. So my question is, well, isn't this legally mandated? If you receive any federal dollars, CMS dollars, since it's for Medicaid or Medicare, you're legally required to collect race and ethnicity data under OMB standards, which is the race and ethnicity standards. And they're like, well, yeah, but we buy these off-the-shelf EHR systems, and we're kind of just stuck with what they have. My question back to them was, but are you really? Or you just never thought about it before? Or thought about what the impact of that is? When I looked at the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, there's a data set that comes through the CDC, which is a violent death reporting database. In that, they take individuals who have experienced violent deaths, and they go through and they identify, they pull in all of their EHR records. They try to find everywhere this individual has been. They have law enforcement records, and it creates a picture of what happened in this individual's death. The same kind of database exists for maternal and infant health. When you will do maternal and infant health death reviews, for example, and others, they pull in all of this information. So what are they using it for? This data tells us the story where we, as healthcare providers and facilities, have the opportunities for intervention, prevention, and to improve the lives and well-being of our communities. Out of a data set like this, there's a paper that was recently published that found that for pregnancy-associated maternal death, the #1 for American Indian and Alaska Native people is suicide. Suicide. The second is murder. When we went and looked deeper into that, what you find is the #1 associated thing with that is intimate partner violence, and whether or not our providers did the screening for the intimate partner violence screening. And in fact, we found that only 36% of those had actually been accomplished for those that were in this data set for us to look at. But in order to get to the data, the problem is that we know that it's a drastic underreporting. Because of what may seem like a simple thing, there's not a checkbox. And without the checkbox, how do we know? And so as part of this work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, my organization and I have embarked on what we call decolonizing data for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. It's recognizing every single person in those data sets as somebody who is loved, as somebody who mattered, as somebody who had relationships, children, families, communities. And we also recognize in that there's a very unique thing about American Indian Alaska Native data, is that under the agreements with the United States federal government, under our treaties and here in Alaska, the Alaska Claims Settlement Act, there's a way that resources are allocated based on numbers. And very often those numbers do not come from the tribes. There are 229 federally recognized tribes in the state of Alaska. There are also numerous American Indians like my dad, who moved here, live here and access services. And did you know that those resources that are coming from the federal government for Native healthcare are not coming out of your state healthcare dollars? What does that do for your community? It's an influx of resources to help you all work together. Because if you're not working with AHHA, if you're not working with Chief Andrew Isaac, if you're not, I can keep going on, then you're not bringing together the resources in a way that builds a web of safety and wellness for our communities. It's working together, but we need, as tribal communities, the data that I was just talking about, we know it's a direct underreporting. Too often, we know people walk into clinics and to hospitals, people will be filling out forms for them, or maybe they missed it, and they'll be like, they'll look at them, and then they will visually decide what race and ethnicity they are. And looking at data in hospital systems across the nation, research has shown us for racial misclassification, we call it being born Native and dying white, is that in most vital statistics, your birth certificate says Native, and in between, depending on the state, 25 to 44% are racially misclassified as white in their EHR records or in their death certificates. Because people just aren't asking. And sometimes it's because people are uncomfortable doing something. So we got to think about, how do we improve the quality of the information we're gathering? How do we look at, how do you get the largest influx of resources, particularly in an environment like this, for the healthcare of people, by ensuring that you have the appropriate data gathered on American Indians and Alaska Natives so that it can be utilized for the prepaid benefit. So I don't know if you all have ever heard of it like this before, but the healthcare for American Indians and Alaska Natives that AHHA and others provide is a prepaid benefit as a direct result of our relationship with the federal government. Prepaid benefit. It is not a welfare benefit, it is not a handout, it is a prepaid benefit. It was recently upheld in a 2021 district court decision where it said that American Indians and Alaska Natives have a legal right through treaties and agreements like here in Alaska for quality, physician-led, fully funded healthcare. Fully funded being the sticky point. In order to fully fund it, I just gave a congressional testimony about 6 weeks ago to House Appropriations, specifically on the needs within the Alaska, not just Alaska, but across the nation, Native healthcare systems in regard to ensuring we get the right data in order to get the correct congressional allocation that then flows across the Alaska Native state of Washington, every country, wherever, or sorry, I say countries, I'm talking about tribes, but within every state in the nation for where there are federally recognized tribes. Without that data, we don't get the resources. Without that data, little 6-year-olds like me are experiencing some of the outcomes that I experienced. And I wish that my story was unique, and I wish I hadn't heard it last week. So my hope for all of us is, what do we do to fight, to push, to ensure that we are gathering the stories through the data appropriately and working to ensure that we get the resources we need. During COVID-19, Seattle was the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. My clinic was, it was towards the end of January in 2020. By second week of February, my clinic was full of Native people and other low-income individuals who were clearly infected with COVID-19. We were quickly, we ran out of PPE very quick. And in fact, my physicians were sewing their own masks and trading them out in between, because we had run out of masks, we had no gowns, we had nothing. And at that time, I'm sure you all know, we all didn't know what we were doing yet. And so we were trying to do our best. And in fact, with everything gone, we actually, one of our physicians put out a call, because we had the most people who were suffering and dying. And so one of my physicians put out a call, because we needed scrubs, because we were having our providers, every kind of provider would change in between every single patient we saw, they would change scrubs. But then we couldn't get laundry services to do them because they were all too afraid. So the executive team, including myself, would take them home at night, do 4 loads of laundry, fold them up, bring them in the next day, and try to keep things going. So the CEO and myself, we put out calls to our Indian Health Service partners, we put out to our local state, and then to our county. So we get a big box in the mail, and her and I are like, oh my God, let's not tell anybody yet, because we're clearly going to have to make decisions about whatever PPE is in here, and somebody's going to suffer as a result of it. So we go and we open up this box, and instead of receiving PPE, the federal government sent us a box of body bags. We're a community health center. Somebody dies, we are legally required to call 911. We have no use for body bags. And I remember holding it there, like it kind of like crushed my heart. And I remember looking at that box and thinking, well, damn, this is exactly what we've often been handed as Native people, is just enough to bury them, but not enough to ensure the thriving our communities deserve. And so we got to work. We published this report. It was the very first of its kind. I'd been invited by Senator Patty Murray, who led one of the most powerful committees in the Senate, to provide testimony in regards to the impact of COVID-19. And she sent me a list of things she wanted me to talk about. And I'm like, oh, I'm not going to do what she asked. Here's my one and only opportunity. I have Congress right in front of me on Zoom. We're doing everything by Zoom. And so we went and gathered all of the data that was being reported by states, including by Alaska. And at this point in time, Alaska was not doing great. And reported and gave a report card score in regards to the COVID-19 infection rates. We were only actually able to use data from 23 states at that time, because they were doing so badly on gathering race and ethnicity and doing, at that time, the reporting to the CDC. Despite in that legislation there being a legal requirement, again, a legal requirement to report race and ethnicity. With what data we did find, we found that Native people were infected at 3.5 times the infection rate of the overall general population, and the similar rates in regards to deaths. So instead of doing what Senator Patty Murray was telling me, I presented this, the data genocide of American Indians and Alaska Natives. And sometimes I get a lot of crap from people about, like, you're saying genocide. Like, yes, because I was surrounded by people who were dying. And I can't say there hasn't been a time in my life where that hasn't been my experience. It shouldn't be the common experience of my community. And the data is a key component of that. So then Congress had taken that bad data, including what came from the state of Alaska, and then they allocated resources inappropriately based on the information that state hospital systems had gathered. And as a direct result, Native people across the nation and in the state died. It has that impact. I already knew this because of the work I've been doing for decades. I felt like I've been yelling on the top of rooftops that nobody had ever heard, but we were in a unique place and time that we were able to bring this forward. And so we've actually, and I'll share this later, published a paper called How You Can Address Data Genocide that gives, and I'm going to go over some specifics on what you can do and how you can work to ensure that appropriate information is gathered. And what does that look like, and what do the partnerships look like? I've already talked about racial misclassification. Very often that is done based on observed race, where people will be like, oh, you know, just kind of decide based visually. I very often in Seattle get Hispanic. I'll get white. I've never had anybody visually identify me as American Indian nor Alaska Native, which are two different things. And so there is, as part of, here in Alaska, it's a little bit different. You have a lot more visibility of the Native communities because of the 229 federally recognized tribes. There are more tribes in the state of Alaska than any other state in the nation. And there is visibility in the state of Alaska more than other places I work at. In some of the other places I work at, they're like, well, we didn't even know we had Native people here. And I actually had multiple people be like, I'm so sorry, but I didn't know there was like enough of you alive to make us consider what we need to do here. And I was like, tell me the truth. Tell me what you think. There's nothing you can say to offend me as long as we're all working to move forward. And so we have embarked on ensuring that we're providing proper training and looking at where is the lack of tools that exist. What are your databases ones that collect race and ethnicity? Do you know how to collect tribal affiliation and what that means? Here in the state of Alaska, AHHA has done some incredible work to change their data systems to make sure that they're not eliminating more people. So here's another very common one. I've seen the state of Alaska do it, although with the advocacy here through ANTHC and some partners that I have at their Tribal Epidemiology Center who have worked very hard. But you will see data that is reported out, and it will say American Indian and Alaska Native single race only, as compared to non-Hispanic whites, African American, whoever their comparison group is. So American Indian, Alaska Native only. I was on a call with the CDC as being consulted on the fact that they had gathered information on their YBRS, which is a behavioral assessment of youth across the nation. It's what we use. For example, SAMHSA uses it, AHHA, other folks in terms of directing behavioral health funding in regards to and understanding behavioral health in youth across the nation. So they were like, hey, Abigail, well, we don't have a large enough sample size. They didn't talk to enough Native youth in order to have statistically sound information to put out information in regards to YBRS. I said, really? Like, let's go through your data set. So they started going through and I said, well, let's just stop, like first page. So you are only including American Indian, Alaska Native only. You have, and can increase this sample size, I believe it was increased it by like 36%, if you include multiracial American Indians and Alaska Natives. So why haven't you done that? And they said, well, that's just how we've always done it. But is that, as a scientist, my question was, is that a scientifically sound decision? Why are you doing that? So most folks don't know why that exists. In the United States, for American Indians and Alaska Natives, there was an effort by the United States government to eliminate us by establishing blood quantum. Blood quantum decided that I used to carry around in my wallet a card that said exactly how much Pawnee blood I carried based on how many times, my dad's family had intermarried or whatever. The goal of the United States government is if you could get rid of us through blood quantum, they wouldn't have a responsibility for our prepaid benefits, for healthcare, law enforcement, land, all of those things. And so they instituted, starting with vital statistics actually, they instituted a way to say you have to have this much degree of Native blood in order to be real Indian. That's not a real thing. That's not how culture and community works. And there's a reason it only attaches to one group. And so it became embedded into data systems. So there is no scientifically sound reason whatsoever to only use data on American Indian, Alaska Native, only identified people. And yet the way that we gather data systems puts people in 2 or more races or in the other category. And as an epidemiologist, I call it lazy epidemiology. And it's a trash data category. It means nothing. You can't calculate anything on it. You lose big portions of your sample size. You can't gather and calculate that data to understand what's going on in the community. And it has no scientific standing, and instead is the result of a political decision from 200 years ago that's still affecting all of us today. So these are the kind of information, just like basic stories, and I'll share with people, and then the people at with YBRS, they were like, oh, we didn't know that. It's like, I know you don't. Well, that's why we have to share the story amongst each other. Because nobody decides who is a tribal member other than that tribe. That is not the federal government's decision. That is only a tribal decision. And so thinking about who are the individuals that you partner with, the organizations who have the answers to how to gather the stories, how to interpret them. I do a lot of work in sexual assault. I was working with individuals in programs that I direct in Seattle. It was 150 Native women who had experienced sexual assault. One of them was an elder who had been sexually assaulted more than 50 times in her life. And as I looked at that information, because she had experience, she was a boarding school survivor from the state actually, who was living on the streets in Seattle and accessing services at my organization. She'd experienced sexual assault so many times. She sat for 4 hours and did this incredibly invasive survey. And she said, I did it because I don't want this to happen to anybody else. And when I look at the data, if I had kept her and included her in the scientific calculations, I'm gonna get super nerdy here. If I had done that, it would have skewed all the other information. But how do I honor her story still? And so I asked her, and I asked the programs in which she was served by, and what was the best way to honor her story? And they said it's by sharing the story. She said it was by sharing the story. And the reason that she participated. So sometimes you need to think about how do you honor the stories that your data is telling? And not do it in a deficit-based way, because I could have left you all with this elder, a little over 75, has been sexually assaulted this many times. But what happens when I add, but she shared this information because she didn't want it to happen to anybody else? We have to shift away from a deficit-based narrative of using data to only think about people as a problem to solve. And too often in quality work, we're looking at a problem. Sometimes we start attaching the people in the data to the problem, and we want to solve it. We have to think about them as the answers. How do you engage with patients? How do you engage with advocacy groups? How do you engage with organizations? So the data that you put forward is meaningful, not a tiny little marble that made you feel better. Because I think those missionaries probably felt great about the box they sent. But they didn't know what happened afterwards. Instead, how do you do that in a way that makes meaningful change and recognizes that the patients and people we serve are not a problem to solve? They hold within them all of the answers, which is why community engagement, in however you define that in your organizations, has to be defined with clear metrics of how you are measuring yourselves on that community engagement and the way it's incorporated in the work that you're doing. So I'm gonna just share a few things in regards. So I've done a lot of training of front desk, frontline hospital folks on asking for race ethnicity. Honestly, people are super uncomfortable doing it. They are way more comfortable sliding across the questionnaire. What happens when that questionnaire comes back and people don't fill it all the way out? They might ask for things like, well, you know, are you sure that, you know, you didn't fill out the family history? Can you redo that? It's not very often they say, well, you didn't fill out the race and ethnicity. Is there something that I can assist you with, or kind of walk people through that, because it makes them uncomfortable. I've actually never had more crying people than when I trained them on how to ask for race and ethnicity, because it makes people uncomfortable. And so we have to recognize that change is uncomfortable. And I always feel like if I'm not a little uncomfortable in what I'm doing, I'm probably not doing it right, because we do not have quality health outcomes for everybody who walks in our doors, and we know that. We need to get to that point. So we got to get uncomfortable with the status quo of what we've been doing and identify the opportunities in moving forward. So I do trainings, and it's very important to think about these kinds of considerations, and they are available, and these slides will be available, and how to ask for race and ethnicity. This is my grandma Katie. I always love this picture when I talk about it, because I'm like, clearly, my cousin Emmanuel here. It's like, Grandma, why? We just gotta do it. It just needs to be done. And it can, you know, like it's sometimes that face of, come on, I've got to bring you with me. What is it and how is it that we're going to bring people with us? And we need people at all levels. We need CEOs, we need medical assistants, we need front desk people. We need everybody to come together and be the same teachers, the same listeners, and move some of the unhappy faces. Because now if I think about my cousin Emmanuel, like she thinks this picture is hilarious. He is now 26. This is one of the things when he thinks back to our grandma about what the gift it was. My grandma Katie always said she fought for subsistence hunting and fishing rights here in the state of Alaska for Alaska Native people. She said, all I wanted to do was feed my family. All we want to do is ensure quality health outcomes for all people, and special consideration for those who have a prepaid benefit for quality-led healthcare that results in allocation of resources, not from your state dollars, but from the federal dollars that flow into the state that provide employment, that provide culturally based intervention and programming, and builds the web of community across us all. So who are your partners? You need to identify who your partners are. What regions are you in? Have you worked with the state? The folks at AHHA who have worked specifically in the data, they've actually taken some of the recommendations I initially gave them and they expanded on them. Are you following with OMB basic legally required principles if you receive $1 from CMS? $1 for HRSA. You are legally required. Does the off-the-shelf EHR allow for the collection of information in these basic categories? And how do you make sure that you're not misusing the data? So there is a concept, it's not a concept, it is a concept, but it is also a legal framework called Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And as a result of our relationship with the federal government, the communities you work with, tribal communities, villages, ANTHC, all of those, they have a legal right around the governance of the data of their people that may end up in your systems, you know, specialty care, other things like that, who end up in your systems. That data also belongs to them. So how do you engage in a conversation related to Indigenous data sovereignty, and who are the right people for you to do that with? That's one of the things you need to work to identify. Here's some basic understandings of what, how to gather race and ethnicity. You gotta ask for race and ethnicity separately. That's another issue. Often in data, people will pull out Hispanic identified people. And so my children are Mexican, Athabascan, Pawnee. Early on, I trained them to not check Hispanic because at that time when I was working and doing this, I knew that they would only be included as Hispanic. And they would not be included in the native data, which was more important, honestly, for their treaty rights as they're enrolled citizens of the Pawnee tribe in Oklahoma. And so, but that my children shouldn't have to decide. They should be able to experience all of who they are. And so you have to gather that information separately. You have to calculate it. So including Hispanic, multi-race, single race, however it's gathered, all need to be included and counted when you're looking at native data. American Indian, Alaska Native are separate categories. It has to be, you have to say is somebody American Indian or Alaska Native, and we use those words specifically. So in federal policy, if you have data or things that are coming Native American and Indigenous, well, I do identify with all of those things. There's a legal framework that exists in this country that the way that Congress allocates dollars for Native people, you have to use those words. If those words aren't used, then the treaty rights don't apply. So these are actual policy language, which is why when I look at people's data sets, and they'll have Native American / Sometimes they'll say Alaskan Native, which is a no-no. Alaskan Native, or it will say Indigenous, or it will combine Pacific Islanders, and like, no, this is all inappropriate. You need to use the legal language. So you're actually meeting the legal definition of what you're required to do under OMB. And it allows for the appropriate information to be going to the tribal communities. People need to be able to identify with whoever they are. And sometimes I'll get people like, Abigail, the numbers don't add up to 100. It doesn't have to. That is also what I call lazy epidemiology. It does not have to add up to 100. That is just a misunderstanding. It doesn't have to add up to 100. So you can have people identifying with multiple different groups, and they should be appreciated for all of who they are. These are some areas where, in terms of like, this actually came from when I was working with somebody to change their database systems. And we have examples of this on my website, uihhi.org, where there's actually a document called Best Practices in American Indian and Alaska Native Data. Tribal affiliation is very important. So I am not, I mean, I am American Indian and associated with Alaska Native, but I'm Pawnee and Athabascan. Those are two very different cultures. Those are two very different communities. And it is also, my identity is tied to my tribe. Also, in my data set, so for example, in my data at the Seattle Indian Health Board, I know that the Tlingit and Haida communities is one of the highest utilizations in my community there. We know that's recognized by the Tlingits and Haidas, who have so many Native people in the area of Seattle that they have a chapter there in a big facility. And we partner with them and work with them. And we're able to share with them aggregate information on the health and well-being of their community because we have enough data to do so. That allows President Peterson of the Tlingit and Haidas and his community to direct appropriate resources to serve their people. So gathering tribal affiliation also allows you to identify who are those large utilization groups. Is there an opportunity to identify with those particular tribes, village corporations, whoever it is, to share information on the health and well-being of their people, non-identifiable, we all know how to do that, and so that they can use their resources and you can all be weaving together, not working separately. So tribal affiliation allows for that, and you need to make sure that it is done appropriately. Again, the folks at AHHA have been doing an incredible job of this. What is the change that can be? So this is actually the body bags we received. My boss let me take them home. She thinks I'm weird. I was like, hey, Esther, I remember getting home that night and I sat in my backyard and I cried for 45 minutes because during COVID, I was trying not to take my trauma to my children. So I sat in my backyard way too much. But I remember lifting up that first bag and we were at a table like this and like toe tags fell out. And I'll never forget the sound again. And I told Esther, like, I cannot live, honestly, like, how am I gonna make it through this with just having received body bags? So I was like, can I have them? Because I'm also an artist. And so I took those body bags and over the course of about 8 months, continuously working on COVID and then coming home and doing art, I turned it into a dress, which you can actually, it was published actually in Vogue magazine. My nieces were impressed with me for the very first time in my life. It was in Vogue magazine. And I made a dress that comes from my father's tribe called a ribbon dress, and it's a healing dress. And down the side of it, I put these red hands. So this is the side of that dress, because during COVID, I was working in the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, and we were seeing higher rates as a result of people being quarantined with their abusers. So the rates increased as a direct result. During COVID-19, according to the most recent papers put out, we lost 7 years of life expectancy across 3 years for the entire nation for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And we are working so hard to regain that. And the only way we're going to do it is with partners. The only way we're going to be doing this is together. The only way we're going to be doing this is to recognize I'm tired of red hands. I want the faces. I want the families. I want the babies. I want the little girls healthy and whole. I'm tired of red hands. which is meant to symbolize and is often worn across Indigenous people's faces and protests and things like that, to recognize our invisibility and the silencing of our communities. I want to make something that doesn't have red hands anymore. And how do we do that together? It's going to take bravery. It's going to take exploration of things you don't know. This is my son. When we get off the plane in Fairbanks, we're heading back to my mom's house in Delta, and then we'll often then head up to Minpasta Village to see family. One of the first things he does is he runs out to a particular kind of a tree, a kind of a birch tree. And this is what I was taught by my family is you peel off the bark, and if you chew that tree, it will help with like a little bit of a headache if you're not feeling quite well. And so I'm sitting in college at 23 in a biology class, and all of a sudden this picture pops up, and my teacher's just like, I was like, wait, that's my tree, what's going on here? And come to find out, the enzyme that is the basis for aspirin comes from trees like this. So I have been taught that traditional medicine, and actually, I know what it means to go out and gather birch and turn it into a basket. And what it means to gift that and to fill it with berries. The knowledge from our communities is rich, it is diverse, and it is embedded. Because how many people here have ever taken aspirin? Indigenous knowledge right there. You've been really benefiting from that. And our children deserve to know it. And they deserve to live. They deserve the opportunity to get to where they know it and can also pass it down. So my son, he just happened to be in an old t-shirt I had from an old census thing. I was like, this is the best picture ever. Be counted, look at cultural knowledge. I was like, I couldn't have posed this picture if I wanted to. But it's also going to take bravery. Systems don't like change. People don't like change. And sometimes change costs. I was working with an organization who didn't have the appropriate drop-down drop-down menus. I worked with them and their local tribal partners. We identified what data we were going to gather, how it was going to be shared, all of these things. And then like, oh, hard stop. This is going to cost $52,000 to make this change to our medical system, to add these categories. So $50,000. Okay, where are you going to get the $50,000? I'm like, oh no, we're not getting it. I said, no, you're asking the wrong question. You're thinking the wrong thing. You got to think when those barriers come up, you have to think creatively about how you overcome them. And in this instance, we worked with the provider because they also were one that other Indigenous communities were utilizing. And it actually became a way and something they promote in regards to, they have the appropriate data sections in there. They basically got free help from me, free help from the organization, and now they utilize it as a selling point. So they got out of the $50,000. Sometimes you're gonna have to pay $50,000. And you have to look at the long-term opportunities that come with that, whether it be investments and federal dollars like I've been talking about, whether it be in the opportunities to build community partnerships where they see that there is a bi-directional relationship, just not extractive of their knowledge, but rather investment in time and resources that builds up partnerships and relationships. And it's going to take bravery. Bravery can be hard. So you have to build networks of people who are brave with you. You are in a room full of what looks like great networkers to me. This is your opportunities to build together, to build relationships, partnerships, so that the health and well-being of my community is the health and well-being of yours. And it is all of us together that have the opportunity for true bravery. So I have a niece. Her name is Awawai. Her father's family is Indigenous people of New Zealand, the Maoris. And the way that the children are named is that the grandfathers name them. So Te Awawai was named by her grandfather from Tauranga, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And he named her Rivers of Living Peace. This girl is wild. One time my sister came out and she dug like 8 holes around the front of their house like a dog. I don't know what she did, but she dug holes. She was like 7. One time I couldn't find her and she was up in a tree where she had decided this is her father's fault. He had watched the show Naked and Afraid. He was like 9 years old. She's like, I can do that. She had woven clothes for herself, like a skirt and all kinds of stuff up in the tree. She was up there. She is wild. And my sister was like, she's like, it took me a second to be like, hey, you know, Terranova actually is at peace. Because we often think about peace like that creek, Fish Creek, where my uncle's dropping marble after marble, as being silent, calm, and still. And I think of myself at the same age as Terranova. I was silent and still because I had no peace. Terranova is as wild as she needs to be in respecting her elders, her community, and having just joy and fun that every one of our children and people deserve. She is peace like a tsunami. And that's our opportunity. So I'm going to end with something I do sometimes, and I feel like I'm just going to do it here because I'm home. So her father teaches them the song, so when they go back to New Zealand, they can, singing is a big part of all of our Indigenous communities, but for Maoris, there are specific songs, and for her iwi, her tribe, it's important. So she sings a song, and I was sitting in their home and listening to the kids sing this, and I thought, oh, if I could have sang this, if I could have sang this song, to see these next generations who are changing because of the work you all do, because of the quality care, because of the love and compassion, and because of what I know you're going to walk out of these rooms and change the data, we can have all of our children sing a song like this. I'm not going to sing it in Maori because I don't speak that, but I'll just sing this little piece of it that I want the opportunity for every one of our children to sing. I can never be lost. I am a seed, Lord of greatness, descended from a line of chiefs. That's who I am. Be brave, push forward in power, build networks and communities, and I hope all of your children can sing a song like that. So thank you. Questions or comments for Abigail? I love them all. There's no wrong question.
You go.
Oh, thank you.
I think I'm absorbing. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Oh, we have a question.
I don't know if it feels hard to ask a question or a comment after that powerful presentation. It's kind of, I need a moment to like tackle this, you know, but I do want to say in Anchorage over 10 years ago, within the tribal council worked with the district to incorporate understanding of Alaska Native students as not only in the data, and that social epidemiology transformed funding and programs in the district. And it really was a combination of health data understanding, social, you know, if we hadn't had a social epidemiologist to help have those conversations happen and explain why they're important, that wouldn't have changed in a school district, which then impacts kids' health. My question is a very small data collection question though. When we were working on our community health needs assessment over this last year, and we, you know, included select all options under our racial identity category, we separated out as for Southeast community, close to Canada, you know, and so we separated out Alaska Native as an option, and then also American Indian and Canadian First Nations as a combined other option. Would you recommend having separated that out further or kept it?
Yeah, when it comes to First Nations, so I do the same in our data sets. We have significant number of J Treaty folks who come back and forth across the border. And so significant number of people who are First Nations, but within in this instance, a J Treaty means that they have tribal ties to both sides across the border. So it's important to ensure that you're collecting First Nations, American Indian, and Alaska Native separately, so that you can appropriately appropriately account for those individuals. And some, in this instance, First Nations people, and I know there's some here in Alaska too, as Jay Treaty folks, are American Indian and First Nation. So that's why they need the opportunity to check all of them. And then again, that information is really vital to advocating for all people.
I'm just curious, there's still a lot of tribes that still look at quantum blood. What's your thought process around that as to why they're still doing that?
Yeah, part of it is, and so it's variety for different tribes. And again, every tribe gets to make their own decision in regards to that. And that is their tribal council's ability to do so. I am personally not an advocate for it, but there is some assumptions that, particularly for tribes who people think that one myth is that Native people, and I know that we have some casinos that have popped up here in Alaska in the last couple of years, that tribal casinos are just inundating thousands and thousands of dollars in the communities, and now we have all these rich Indians. 8% of tribal casinos more break even. The rest are just significant economic dollars and hiring and things like that, but they're not making a lot of money. And then there are the 8%, just like there are the 1% in this nation who are billionaires, like there's some that are very successful. And so some of it has been with perceived perceptions of where economic development could be and how people are going to try to inundate the tribes. The other is that once you go to move and change that, it takes significant capacity and investment to change the entire way your tribal government operates. And so most tribal communities are talking about and considering it. For example, my children are enrolled in Pawnee, but I'm probably going to change that because my kids don't marry another Pawnee, they won't be enrolled. So we're in the middle of changing blood quantum in my tribe in Oklahoma. And if that doesn't work out, honestly, they're eligible for enrollment in another tribe that doesn't do that. So culturally, I would like for them to be where they spend the most time, which is here in Alaska and in Oklahoma. But it's a hard decision. And like, even I'm saying that, it sounds so complicated, right? Yeah, I sit at home and think about this. But that's just one family. That's just me and my 2 boys. For an entire tribe to make that change, who are already struggling with the appropriate resources and capacity, a change like that is very expensive. So there's both the we're not quite sure, others who are we're just not talking about it right now, others who are in conversations like my tribe is, and others who've had the capacity to make significant change. And again, it is all their decision. Each tribe needs to have their own decision and conversations related to what that looks like. And then we all just need to go with what they say. My tribe, I get to yell, but.
Do you have information and data on some of the tribes that are very small or anything, or are non-existent? So I am from New Zealand, and my iwi is a larger tribe, and even though the Maori are Indigenous people there, they weren't the first, right? So the Moriori are gone now. We lost the even part of the blood in there. So what about those tribes? Valdez Native tribes, a very small tribe. What do you recommend for us in healthcare to support those smaller and or potentially, endangered tribes?
Yeah, so it's a complicated thing. So I know Chief Bill and them up at Valdez and others are doing incredible work. I work with the tribal community. It was actually, they had a very small tribe. And in their community, there was something going on. How it ended up there is that they didn't have a single live birth for 5 years. Not a single baby was born alive. All stillbirths and miscarriages for 5 years. And so being such a small tribe, in order to be able to gather enough information that then wouldn't harm the community, this is probably where I had the most experience in going in and being like, okay, what does a tribal census look like for just you? How do you know how to reach these people? And how do we go out and gather enough baseline information to be able to come up with key findings and things that we can look at specifically related to? And in this instance, we were able to do some of that, identified some factors. We never actually figured out what happened. We tested water, we tested land. There was no idea exactly what happened. But after that, I was working with a large university group. And they're like, oh, we'd love to at some point publish a paper on this. And then chair said, she said, come back in 3 years when we've had the time to grieve. And so then when you think about very small populations of tribes, communities, there are going to be considerations that you need to take. It would have been inappropriate for this group to actually publish that information until this tribe has a time to grieve. And I'm part of a network of Indigenous Data sovereignty folks, including my friend Taco, who is in New Zealand. And we have a network of like, how do we work to bring some of these methodologies together? And there's some really good information. I actually spent 2 years one time traveling across 6 states working with tribal elders on how to do exactly this. Bring small populations, what are the considerations that we need to make when doing this? And I love that work. But it really only applied to those 6 states. What it did was give us lessons learned to then think about how we apply that in different instances. But the communities themselves know where to go to gather the information. I have been at funerals, and I was like, are you sure we should be gathering data here? And they're like, yes. I've been at tribal council meetings. I've been like, wherever they say is the right place to go. Because some of the tribes, and it's like I work with a tribe right now that actually won't tell anybody in the United States how many tribal members they have. And that is their legal right. And they use their information and gather it, but it is because they are a small tribe. And so there is just, their decision making on that. But when we come in partnership with them, I do know a lot of information about their tribe because I've been assisting them in gathering this information and looking at health and well-being. Doing work with another tribe right now that has decided they want to do 5 by 5. They found that their the average life expectancy is 51 years old for their tribal community, and they've determined in 5 years they're going to increase their life expectancy by 5 years. And they are doing like mind-blowing stuff that I can't wait at some point for them to share. But they haven't released as much of that information because sometimes you release information on small populations, you can really hurt them. And so it has to be done in partnership with them. Like I said, with this group, they needed the ability to grieve and to have that.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna take a break until, let's do 11:35. That's about a 12-minute break, and stretch and get some coffee and a snack, and let's all give Abigail a hand. Thank you.